Welcome to the Principal Source audio presentation of Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks. Postmodernism is the leading intellectual movement of the late 20th century. It has replaced modernism, the philosophy of the Enlightenment. For modernism's principles of objective reality, reason, and individualism, it has substituted its own precepts of relative feeling, social construction, and groupism. This substitution has now spread to major cultural institutions, such as education, journalism, and the law, where it manifests itself as race and gender politics, advocacy journalism, political correctness, multiculturalism, and the rejection of science and technology. Stephen Hicks received his Ph.D. in philosophy from Indiana University and is the chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Rockford College in Rockford, Illinois. Dr. Hicks is the author, with David Kelly, of The Art of Reasoning, Readings for Logical Analysis, as well as other books and articles. He has participated in a number of conferences and discussions on objectivism and is currently researching and writing a book on business ethics. At the 1998 summer seminar of the Institute for Objectivist Studies, Dr. Hicks offered a systematic analysis and dissection of the postmodernist movement and outlined the core objectivist tenets needed to rejuvenate the Enlightenment spirit.
By everyone's account, we have entered a new intellectual era. We are postmodern. Postmodernists claim that modernism has passed away and that we are in an exciting new intellectual era. Opponents of postmodernists look around the new intellectual landscape and don't much like what they see. But they say pretty much the same thing. There seems to have been a major changing of the guard within the academy. From outside the academy, you hear fairly regularly a certain set of themes. They're all anti-Western themes. Columbus was bad, for example. America is a deeply racist and sexist nation. Western ideology is narrow, it's exclusive, it's intolerant. The West is imperialistic, imposing its capitalism, its technology, its science on other non-Western cultures and increasingly upon a fragile ecosystem. Non-Western systems, because they live simply and harmoniously with nature, are superior to ours. Now, underlying all of those themes, we hear a more abstract set of themes fairly regularly: subjectivism, relativism, egalitarianism, both in ethical formulations and epistemological formulations. There is no truth. All cultures' ways are equal. No one group's values have any special standing. So the West's emphasis on science, individualism, capitalism is nothing special. On the other hand, we hear deep themes of cynicism, sometimes in the same paragraph. Everything is political in the sense of nasty power politics. Ad hominem argumentative tactics are legitimate. Crude political correctness is perfectly justifiable. Now, those themes inform much of what goes on in the related professions in the humanities. In literary criticism, the most famous names nowadays are people like Frederick Jameson and Stanley Fish. The notion, for example, that literary texts can be interpreted objectively is rejected. It's replaced by the view that one's group membership that most deeply shapes one's views and feelings. Authors, therefore, no matter what their professed intentions are in novels, are expressing their class interests or their race interests or their sex interests. And so the task of the critic then is recast. We need to deconstruct the text to reveal those deeper underlying interests. And of course, those authors who least embody politically correct attitudes will be subject to the greatest amount of deconstruction. Okay. Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example, in The Scarlet Letter seems, if you read closely, at least ambivalent about Hester Prynne's moral status. Was she a victim or was she a hero? But this ambivalence shows that he is sold out, and what he is sold out is to a fairly authoritarian and masculine religious establishment. Herman Melville in Moby Dick may have thought that he was exploring fairly universal themes about personal ambition and social dynamic, man and nature. But what Ahab really represents is the exploitive authoritarianism of capitalism and the nearly insane drive of technology to conquer nature. In law, the new wave is called critical legal theory, known as the crits, fondly for short. They embody the new wave with their insistence that the so-called objectivity and neutrality of legal reasoning is a fraud. There is no universal standard of justice, there is only competing wills and the coercive assertion of one group's interests over those of other groups. Law in the West is simply a cover for the assertion of white male interests, and the only antidote to that poison is an equally specious assertion of interests of minorities and females. This is associated with advocacy education at all levels. In college, for example, the emphasis in the humanities upon reading the great works of the Western canon is misplaced, according to postmodernism. With respect to the sciences, the claim that no one knows anything for sure implies that science as a method has no special claim, and that we should teach science students to be equally receptive to alternative ways of knowing. Across the board, at all levels, the idea of presenting all sides of a debate in order to foster objective judgment is in many cases deemed silly. Whether the issue is environmentalism or the impact of Columbus's arrival or the status of women and minority groups in the 19th century, slanted presentation and indoctrination is more or less taken for granted. And behind all of those professional applications, we find that the big contemporary names on everyone's lips, the big guns who are appealed to by everyone, are people like Thomas Kuhn and Richard Rorty, two American philosophers, and going across the Atlantic, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Jean-François Lyotard. My purpose today is going to be to understand first and then criticize postmodernism. I think it's false, I think it's destructive, but because of its fairly high standing in the academy, it has done considerable damage and it's in a position to do a great deal more. Postmodernism is a philosophical and a cultural movement, and such movements require that a lot of groundwork be put in place, that a great deal of scaffolding be erected, and that takes a lot of work by intellectuals over several generations. Movements on this scale don't just pop up into existence, but they really are the result of long labor. So I want to first do some intellectual history to show where postmodernism comes from and what it depends upon. To critique it, we need to know where it came from. Postmodernism has many symptoms in a variety of fields and applications, but to cure those symptoms, we need to find the source or sources. All right, first, actually, before we do the intellectual history, I want to define precisely what postmodernism is as a philosophical movement. I want to figure out what theses constitute postmodernism, what distinguishes it from other philosophies. There's a fairly standard rejoinder by postmodernists at this point. They will object to the whole idea of defining postmodernism. This resistance is part of the philosophical package. Postmodernists love plurality, ambiguity. They don't much like singularity and precision. Right? The idea that there's a correct definition is suspiciously like part of that Western realist objectivist package, implying pigeonholing, dissecting, pinning things down, trying to sort out necessary and sufficient conditions like scientists do. Right? Well, I say that's damn right. And I love it. Right? Concepts mean what they mean. That is the source of their power. And the networks of concepts that make up postmodernism is no exception. But there is a fairly legitimate issue here, a somewhat difficult issue. Postmodernism is a whole philosophy, and a philosophy has many components. Sorting out which ones are fundamental and which ones are derivative is often not easy. Postmodernism also has manifestations in all aspects of culture, from law to religion to art to economics, and it's also often not easy to see the connections among all of the cultural manifestations and to connect them to the underlying philosophical themes. But let's do that anyway. I think the easiest starting route would be to focus on postmodernism's contrast to modernism. Since it proclaims itself as postmodernism, understanding what it sees itself as rejecting and moving beyond should be clarifying. And since modernism has been around for several centuries, it is something that it's going to be an easier task to get a grip on. So what's modernism? Well, modernism also is a broad philosophical movement. We heard David speaking about the Enlightenment philosophy this morning, and that's exactly what it is. I have on the board here, and also on your handout on the opposite side of the flow chart, where all of the tables are, a grid or a table. Defining a philosophy involves, in my judgment, 4 essential components and then 1 derivative component. The metaphysical component, when we do metaphysics, we were asking what the basic nature of reality is. An epistemological component, defining the means and nature of human knowledge, how we know, whether it's by reason, intuition, mysticism, or what. An application of metaphysics to the metaphysical nature of human beings. Right? What is our deepest nature? What is the nature of our rational capacity, its relationship to emotion, the relation of our consciousness to reality, whether we have volition or free will, and how that relates to causality. These are all issues of human nature that a philosophy needs to touch on. Questions of value, first in ethics, what is the nature of value, defining virtues, and then as a component of that, the core concepts of social ethics, the moral concepts that are necessary to organize a society. I like to boil that down actually just to 3 questions. Right? Philosophy boils down to what's real, how do you know, and so what? Right? Metaphysics, epistemology, values. Okay. So to have a philosophy, you need to touch on all of those and have systematically worked out answers to all of those major questions. Modernism does that. In philosophy, we locate the beginnings of the modernist movement with René Descartes, primarily for his contributions in epistemology, but more comprehensively with John Locke. René Descartes died in 1650, did most of his writings in the first half of the 17th century. John Locke died in 1704. Most of his major works were published in a really remarkable flurry, 1689 through 1690. The 2 treatises of government, Essay Concerning Human Understanding. In 1690 and 1689, you had the letters concerning toleration, which were extremely important and influential in England. Modernist philosophy flowered comprehensively and became the dominant view in the 1700s. Okay. The dominant set of views by the middle part of the 1700s would be characterized metaphysically by naturalism, epistemologically by an emphasis on reason in human nature, the idea that human beings are born tabula rasa or blank slate. And in ethics and politics, we have a strong emphasis on individualism and liberal democracy. Okay. So on that table that you have there, what I have is on the left side at the top. So what we have here is the branches of philosophy going down, and then you'll find the second column from the right, the modernist essential theses about philosophy and integration. That's essentially the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is essentially the 1700s or the 18th century. Enlightenment philosophy was radical. And the Enlightenment's thinkers saw themselves as radical. They saw themselves as the flip side of the philosophical movement that had dominated the West for 1,000 years. The medieval synthesis, the medieval philosophical outlook had dominated from roughly 400, the time at which Rome's empire was collapsing, on through about 1400. By the 1400s, you can see the Renaissance developing, and what you have in the Renaissance and the Reformation is kind of a centuries-long battle in which the forerunners of the Enlightenment are undermining the medieval synthesis and paving the way for the Enlightenment. The medieval synthesis was the exact opposite of what the Enlightenment ended up with. On metaphysics, instead of the naturalism, you have an emphasis on supernaturalism. Supernaturalism is where it's at. There's a realm superior to nature. This realm is secondary or derivative. In epistemology, reason is de-emphasized or shoved out the door. The primary means by which you know a supernatural dimension is not reason or sensory experience, it's mysticism or if you are not one of the special few chosen by God to receive mystical experiences, it's faith. In human nature, the dominant view is one of original sin and subordination. We are dependent and subordinate to God's will, not our own. And in ethics, obviously, of an ethic of altruism in Christian religion. Politically and economically, also, you have feudalism as the dominant expression of the medieval worldview, with its hierarchy of who's more important than whom, and in fact, who gets to receive the sacrifices and to whom the sacrifices need to be made. Those are the, well, I don't have it on here, and I forgot to bring the handout. Those are the pure forms. Right? Premodernism is a consistent, more or less internally coherent set of answers to all of the major philosophical questions. You find an equally pure and internally consistent one by the time of the Enlightenment. On all of the major fundamentals, they are opposed to each other. The Renaissance is kind of a transition zone. Now, I'm obviously painting with very broad strokes here, using a very wide brush. I think that's justified. We can point out that Enlightenment philosophy was not totally homogeneous, and Enlightenment philosophers disagreed among themselves on many core issues. Descartes, for example, has a highly rationalistic account of what human reason is. Locke has a more empiricistic account of what human reason is. Well, that's the reason why they're at the heads of competing philosophical schools about the nature of reason. But for both of them, and this is the key Enlightenment point, reason was the fundamental. What they disagreed with was exactly what the nature of reason was. And by putting reason as the fundamental and the most important human faculty, the whole Enlightenment project flows from that. Now that's the flip side. If we start with Descartes and Locke and put reason fundamental, this has consequences. Reason, if you emphasize it as a faculty of knowing nature, okay, then you go down this lower half here. Reason systematically directed toward understanding nature gives rise to science as an enterprise, the institution of science. And it's not accidental that all of the groundwork projects in science were being done at roughly this time. Newton's Principia was published in, I think, 1687. Does that sound right? Something like that, contemporary of Locke. Okay. So, we have a contemporary of Locke, in effect, laying the groundworks for the modernist movement in science. If you emphasize that reason is a faculty of the individual, and so that has immediate value consequences, and these are the ones that Locke is emphasizing, you have a strong emphasis on individualism. Each of those then has derivative consequences. If you follow the individualism, for example, politically emphasizing individualism gives rise to liberal democratic forms of government, and so we have all the liberal democratic revolutions going on in the 1700s. In economics, if you emphasize individualism, you get capitalist economic institutions, and so we have Adam Smith in the later part of the 1700s writing Wealth of Nations, 1776 to be exact. If you go down here, science, if you apply it to kind of inanimate objects, you get engineering, the Industrial Revolution picking up steam by 1750. If you apply it to medicine, medicine is being put on a scientific footing in the 1700s. The basic work in biology and chemistry is starting to be done. And then medicine really doesn't come into its own, though, until the 19th century. Those then have later applications. The amount of freedom in the society increases exponentially. You have in the 19th century the ending of slavery for the first time in human history, the ending of the subordination of women, the gradual extension of the franchise, and so on. The old story, wealth explosion as a result of capitalism. Number of material goods that engineering and the Industrial Revolution is producing is huge. And when medicine kicks in, human health and longevity and life expectancy increases dramatically. All right, that is the Enlightenment vision. David read from Condorcet. I mean, he was writing at this time here before most of this institution building had been done, so it was all a projection. From the standpoint of the 20th century, we can look back and see that this worked. Right? This was a set of philosophical ideas that, because they were deeply true, they were able to deliver the goods. The Enlightenment philosophers were able to set up the institutions that were able to fulfill all of the promises that, for example, Condorcet is mentioning. This is what the postmodernists are attacking, and they're attacking it in the most fundamental way possible. They're attacking it down here, or at this end of the flow chart. Reason is what they are attacking in epistemology, and individualism is what they are attacking in the value branches. And so it's not going to be surprising that when you flesh it all out, they end up attacking everything else that's on this list at some point or other. So the technology that comes out of science is attacked, the capitalism is attacked, and then ultimately the liberal democratic institutions are going to be attacked. This set of ideas you end up with then are going to be the exact opposite ones if you attack all of these ones here, and that's the bar chart on the right here. The postmodernists also end up with a fairly coherent, internally anyway, set of ideas that are distinct from the other two. Okay? You end up with anti-realism, as it's called. We can't say that reality is supernatural or that it's natural. Talk about what reality is just meaningless. We are against the idea of saying what reality is. In epistemology, we have a deep skepticism. As a result of that, you get the relativisms. In the human nature, you have some sort of determinism. It's either of a genetic sort or of a biological sort, genetic or biological or environmental sort, both of those attacking the idea that we are autonomous creatures or that we have free will. And then in the value branches, you get the collectivist expressions. The consequences of those ideas when put into practice are that there is no objectivity, so there's no neutral court of appeals possible. All you're going to be left with then is competing group interests. You don't have any rational recourse in sorting out these group interests, so you only have irrational methods possible. If you emphasize the third-person perspective that postmodernists will take, you will have an egalitarian focus. But of course, they end up denying that you can have a third-person perspective, so all you can do is you go back to your first-person perspective, and from that, you appeal to your group membership and you assert your group's interests over other people. So my first question then is going to be, now that we've defined what postmodernism is, and I hope clearly distinguished it from all the other major competitors, to ask the intellectual history question. How did we get from the modern philosophy to the postmodern philosophy? Postmodernism is a phenomenon of the latter half of the 20th century. The Enlightenment philosophy was flourishing in the 1700s. It still continues to flourish in some sectors of our culture. But how did that transition happen? Okay. I want to start with Immanuel Kant. My first historical thesis, or intellectual historical thesis about where this comes from, is that postmodernism is a consequence of a very deep skepticism. Kant published his Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. In my judgment, he is, along with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the most significant figure in the counter-enlightenment. We can have arguments about whether Kant is first or Rousseau is first. That's a fun debate. One of the exciting things about objectivism, though, in my judgment, is the power that it ascribes to philosophical ideas and understanding what goes on in all aspects of human culture and human history. That ideas matter is fairly widely held. A lot of people will subscribe to that thesis, but that the most fundamental philosophical ideas matter, that is a more striking thesis. That's the one that gives objectivism, in my judgment, a fairly unique perspective and take on what goes on in human history and being able to explain it. Now, in the case of Kant, obviously, you don't have to read far into Ayn Rand's writings to figure out that she thinks Kant's philosophy is the worst disaster of all time, that she holds his philosophy responsible for most of the irrationality and the destruction that has gone on in the last 2 centuries. But if you don't know very much about the history of philosophy before and after Kant, it's difficult to see why she singles out Kant. And in her brief and vehement remarks, she does not elaborate upon those, and mostly what they do is they point in a direction where a lot more reading and thinking and research needs to be done. So I'll make a gesture in that direction today. The central thesis that you find in the Critique of Pure Reason is that reason cannot know reality. We know that one. It only knows its own subjective constructs. Now, part of Kant's motivation, writing during the time the Enlightenment is flourishing, is religious. You can see that the religion is taking a beating at the hands of secular naturalistic philosophy. Religion is on the defensive. It's in danger, in fact, of being laughed out of intellectual life. He agrees, however, with the Enlightenment thinkers that religion cannot be justified by reason. And so, as he states in the second preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, I had, therefore, to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. And so the whole project then of the critique is to show why reason cannot have knowledge of reality, and since it can't, that leaves the door open for faith as a means of coming to have beliefs about reality. Okay, so if you know anything about history of philosophy at this point, you can say, well, so what? Why is Kant special on these points? There are lots of earlier skeptics who said we can't know reality. Lots of earlier religious apologists had subordinated reason to faith. Okay, so what makes Kant special on these points? There are two things, I think. The first is that the earlier skeptics had not been as sweeping in their conclusions. They would pick off a particular cognitive operation and raise problems for them. Maybe it's all a perceptual illusion, so thus we undermine our confidence in our perceptual faculties. Or maybe it's a dream, thus undermining our confidence in being able to distinguish truth from falsity or in fantasy. Maybe induction is only probabilistic, right? Thus undermining our confidence in all of our generalizations. But the conclusions of skeptical arguments would be simply that we can't be sure that we are right. We might be, but we can't prove it. Now, Kant's argument is deeper, arguing that in principle, any conclusion reached by any of our faculties must necessarily not be about reality. On principle, because our minds are structured in a certain way, we can't say what reality is. We can only say what the end result of what our minds structured is. And this is going to be completely general. No matter what cognitive faculty you pick out and focus on, that argument applies. So consciousness, with all of its faculties, is thus undermined in a very deep way. Now, Kant is a landmark in a second respect. Earlier skeptics, despite their negative conclusions, continued to conceive of truth as a correspondence between mind and reality, or between consciousness and reality. Kant then went a step further and redefined truth on subjective grounds. If our minds are disconnected in principle from reality, then to speak of any type of conscious relationship, including truth, as a correspondence to a reality that we can't know, that makes no sense. Okay? And so we then need to redefine truth, not in terms of a correspondence to reality, but internally and subjectively. And for him, it's going to be an internal relationship of coherency and consistency. So what you find then with Kant is that external reality drops out of the picture totally. We can't know it, and we don't define truth in terms of it. And that is why Kant is a landmark. So I start my story with Kant as we march along to postmodernism. After Kant, really the history of philosophy is the story of German philosophy. Kant died at the beginning of the 19th century, just as Germany was beginning to replace France as the world's leading intellectual nation. It is German philosophy that sets the program. Now I want to focus briefly on two strands in German philosophy in the 19th and the 20th century. And I'll go to this next slide here. Okay. One strand starts with Hegel and runs through Marx. Hegel is definitely the most important and influential German philosopher of the 19th century. Marx, not influential in the 19th, the most influential in the 20th. Both take off from Kant, but cast Kant's deepest conclusions in a different direction. For example, one of Kant's backup arguments to show that reason is impotent appears in a section starting about 2/3 of the way through the Critique of Pure Reason. The section is called The Antinomy of Pure Reason, and its purpose is to show that reason is way out of its depth when it tries to figure out deep truths about reality. Kant there develops 4 pairs of parallel arguments on 4 metaphysical issues showing that on those issues, reason validly leads to contradictory conclusions. You can prove that the universe had a beginning in time, but you can equally soundly prove that the universe must be eternal. You can prove that the world must be made up of simplest parts, and also that it can't be, that we have free will, and that strict determinism is true, and that God must exist, and that God can't be proven to exist, or that he doesn't exist. This shows, Kant concludes, that we can never know reality. Right? Because there what we're trying to do is know reality, but we are running into contradictions. Our reason, therefore, must be limited to internal stuff manipulating and reconstructing its own subjective creations. Now, Hegel thinks Kant has missed a deep point here. The antinomies are not a problem for reason, contrary to Kant, but rather the key to the whole universe. The antinomies of reason are only a problem if you think logical contradictions are a problem. And that was Kant's mistake. Right? He was too trapped into the old Aristotelian logic of non-contradiction. What Kant's antinomies show is not that reason is limited, but that we need a new and better kind of reason. Right? One that embraces contradictions and sees the whole of reality as evolving out of contradictory forces. So that's this third Hegel-Marx point here. Hegel also differs from Kant in adding an evolutionary component. Evolutionary ideas in the 19th century are in the air. Everyone is, in fact, laying the groundwork for Darwin's explanation in 1859. In contrast to Kant's belief that the subjective categories are necessary and unchanging, Hegel argues that the appropriate categories by which we structure reality are themselves evolving and relative. What is metaphysically and epistemologically true in one epoch will be contradicted by what is true in the next, and so on. Hegel differs from Kant in a third key respect. Groups, not individuals, are the operative units. Kant was way too individualistic. Men's minds are not autonomous. Autonomy was a key point for Kant. Rather, their minds are a function of deeper forces of the universe operating on them. Those deeper forces are primarily, for us as individuals, our surrounding culture, but we are constructed by our surrounding cultures. So it's not that cultures are made up of individuals, but rather cultures have an evolutionary life of their own, and those cultures, as they evolve, construct their constituent individuals as part of the process. Additionally, individuals are secondary ethically speaking, as Hegel puts it in his philosophy of history. Quote, individuals come under the category of means to an ulterior end. Right? That ultimate end, so that was an end of quotation, this is me now, that ultimate end is collective, the process of society evolving toward its own ends, during which it must, of course, quote, trample down many an innocent flower, crush to pieces many an object in its path. Okay? Those objects are the recalcitrant individuals within the society. So that's Hegel. With Marx, we get a more materialistic and pretty much more bloody version of the same general outlook. All right, so what we get from Hegel and Marx are three key ideas. The group is the unit of analysis, not the individual. Deep truths evolve and change over time, and contradictions are to be embraced, right, as built into the nature of reason, and so forth. Now this Hegel-Marx framework is what I fondly like to call the pro-reason wing of German philosophy. Hegel loved to capitalize reason. It was always reason with a capital R. Okay? Marx called his socialism scientific socialism. Okay? And of course, there is a more irrationalist, deeply irrationalist line, the Romanticist line, that comes out of Kant's philosophy. And this one includes major figures such as Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and Denmark's lonely contribution to the history of philosophy, Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, born a generation after Kant, educated in Germany, was, like Kant, deeply worried by the beating religion had taken during the Enlightenment. He was delighted to learn from reading Kant that reason cannot reach noumena, or reality as it is. But where Kant hesitated here saying that therefore the nature of reality is closed off to us, Kierkegaard says that that only proves you can't know reality by reason. Okay? What is needed is a non-rational access to reality. And in accordance with Kierkegaard's deeply felt religious needs, it's an irrational leap of faith that is necessary. The leap of faith has to be irrational, and you have to make the leap knowing that it's irrational. Because after the Enlightenment, we know that we can't prove the existence of God, and after the Enlightenment, we know that the traditional religion that we are making our leap into, the Judeo-Christian tradition, involves all kinds of bizarre paradoxes and contradictions. Okay? If you read, for example, Fear and Trembling, okay, you will find Kierkegaard's panegyric to Abraham. It's the opening section of it. It's worth a read. Abraham is the hero, or one of the heroes of the Old Testament, who in defiance of all reason and all morality is willing to kill his son Isaac simply because God tells him so. Any rational person would raise all kinds of questions and say why this is not a good thing to do. Okay. Kierkegaard, or Abraham, is willing to turn his mind off. God commands, I take the leap, I believe, I do it. Kierkegaard reveres Abraham because he was willing to, as Kierkegaard puts it, crucify reason and leap into absurdity. Kierkegaard has been deeply influential upon theology, especially Protestant and some strands of Jewish theology in the 20th century. Schopenhauer, also of the generation after Kant and a contemporary of Hegel's, agreed that Kant showed reason's inability to grasp reality. This, however, contrary to Kant, is because reality itself is deeply irrational and conflictual, so reason hasn't got a chance. Will and emotion are much deeper faculties than reason, and it is through will and emotion that we grasp the essence of reality. In the next generation, Nietzsche agrees. As he puts it in the second essay of his Genealogy of Morals, the problem with philosophers up to and including Kant was their emphasis on reason. The emphasis on reason means a loss of reliance upon instinct. Once the philosophers took over, men, quote, no longer possessed their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives. They were reduced to thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect. These unfortunate creatures. They were reduced to their consciousness, their weakest and most fallible organ. And again, how pitiful, how shadowy and fleeting, how aimless and capricious the human intellect is. So what Nietzsche means then with his passionate exhortations to be true to oneself is to break out of the artificial and constricting categories of reason. Reason is a tool for weaklings. Weaklings who are afraid to be naked in the face of a cruel and irrational or conflictual reality, and who therefore build fantasy intellectual structures to hide in. The yaysayer, by contrast, the man of the future will not be tempted to play word games, but he will tap into his deepest drives, his will to power, and he will channel all of his instinctual energies in a vital new direction. All right, so stepping back, what we get then from this other post-Kantian strand of philosophy is, again, three key themes. There's an agreement with Kant that reason is impotent or impotent to know reality, the claim that will and emotion trumps reason and yields deep truths about reality, and third, that reality is deeply conflictual or absurd. Death of Nietzsche in the 1900, very convenient, brings us to the 20th century. And so what we need to do is find a way to bring together these two strands of German thought, to synthesize them for the new century. The philosopher who, in my judgment, does this more than anyone is Martin Heidegger. Heidegger, notorious for the obscurity of his prose. Actually, that's pretty much all of German philosophy, but Heidegger's pretty bad. He's also notorious for his actions and inactions on behalf of the Nazis during the 1930s. But he is unquestionably the leading philosopher of the postmodernists. Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault said they were followers of Heidegger. Richard Rorty cites Heidegger as one of the three big guns influencing his thinking. Now Heidegger himself places himself squarely in the Kantian tradition. Reason, as Kant said, is incapable of knowing reality. I'll put this next slide up here. In fact, reason is our primary obstacle to knowing reality. As Heidegger writes in an introduction to metaphysics, logic and reason would forbid us asking certain questions, such as, why is there being and not rather nothing? Or, right, why does being be? Right? Or in our terminology, why does existence exist? Or not non-existence? Now, logically, it seems like an absurdity, or we reach an absurdity whichever way we go. I mean, we could say, for example, well, there's no answer to why existence exists. It just exists for no reason. But if something exists for no reason, that's absurd. Why did you do that? No reason. It was absurd. That's an absurd action. On the other hand, if we say that there is a reason why, or an explanation for why existence exists, then we need, in effect, to step outside of existence to explain it. Or if we step outside of existence, we step into nothing. And that also seems absurd, because then we're going to explain existence from nothing. That you can get something from nothing. And that's absurd. Either way we go, we're deep into absurdity. Well, this doesn't stop Heidegger. Okay. Logic, right, would say that the question is ill-formed. It's contradictory, so the question should be set aside. Existence exists, that's your axiom, you go from there. On the other hand, switching to a Heideggerian first-person perspective, these questions strike a very deep feeling in me. So here I have a conflict. Logic and reason say the question is contradictory and should be set aside, but my feelings urge me to explore the question in a non-verbal, emotional way. Fortunately, as we've learned, this conflict is yet another sign that logic and reason are impotent. Right? And as we know by now, we should expect to find conflict and contradiction at the heart of things. Contradiction is a sign that we're on to something important. Okay? Deep feeling, therefore, trumps logic. And the next step is, of course, if we're honest, when we all consult our core feelings, we find ourselves full of dread, anxiety, and all that other cool stuff Kierkegaard talked about, and then we're off into an existentialist wallow. Now, there's more where that came from, but let's step back and put Heidegger on the flowchart here. With Heidegger, what we get is the two lines integrated. The lessons post-Heideggerians can take from him are, and I've got 6 of them here. I think, yeah, they all should be right there. Conflict and contradictions are the deepest truths about reality. Reason is subjective, impotent. Logical contradiction isn't an argument against anything. Feeling is a deeper guide than reason. Authenticity requires a deeply felt leap into conflict and paradox. And secondly, that you embrace collectivism. Now, I just assert that last one for now without argument. But in Heidegger, you find a very deep collectivism of the nationalistic variety. His sympathies with the Nazis are evidence of this, but in all of his deep philosophical writings, you find a view that authentic living requires that you consciously absorb into yourself your cultural tradition, that you see yourself as part of the development and flow of your people's tradition. All right, so that's my reading of the essence of the continental tradition in philosophy, as it's called. After Kant, the continental tradition fairly quickly and gleefully abandoned reason, putting clashing wills and troubled emotion at the forefront. And in the continental tradition, obviously, we can find a lot of the ingredients of postmodernism. Now, this, though, leaves a problem, because this can't be the whole story, because there's a gap. Postmodernism is thriving in the American Academy here. And in the American Academy, for the longest time, it had little use for Hegel, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger. The Anglo-American tradition, in contrast with Hegel's speculative wanderings and Kierkegaard's wallowings, it allied itself with science, with rigor, with reason, with objectivity. It had been deeply impressed with science, and it saw science as an alternative to the now discredited religious and speculative philosophy. It wanted to make philosophy scientific, and it wanted to justify the roots of science. This positivist spirit, broadly speaking, pro-science, pro-logic, dominated the Anglo-American scene for much of the 19th century and at least half of the 20th century. And so it's got to be the collapse of that positivistic spirit in American philosophy that is also part of the story of the rise to postmodernism. Now, I got a slide here. Since time is short, I'm going to whip through this. This is probably a more familiar story to most of us here. I'll pick out a few big names and put them in a narrative. Okay. Beginning of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell foreshadows what's to come. In the final chapter of an often read introductory book called The Problems of Philosophy, published in 1912, beginning of the century, Russell summarizes the history of philosophy as a repeating series of failure after failure to answer its questions. Can we prove there's an external world? No. Can we prove that there's cause and effect? No. Can we validate any of our generalizations? No. Can we find an objective basis for morality? No way. Russell concludes, therefore, that philosophy can't answer its questions. We've been trying forever, got nowhere, must not be answerable. And so he comes to believe that any value philosophy has can't be in offering truth or wisdom. It's got to be somewhere else. Okay. Ludwig Wittgenstein and the early logical positivists took the problem one step further. Why has philosophy traditionally failed to answer any of its questions? Well, because those questions are meaningless. The mistake earlier philosophers had made was thinking that philosophy was about its own unique subject matter. But that's wrong. Philosophy has no content as such. No metaphysics, no ethics, no theology, no aesthetics. Those are all content and they're all meaningless. This means we need to recast philosophy's function. Philosophy is not a content discipline, it's a method discipline. Its function is analysis, hence the name analytic philosophy, and it should see itself as an assistant to science. So the purpose then of philosophy in this newer analytic tradition is to analyze the perceptual, linguistic, and logical tools that science uses. Scientists perceive, organize their observations linguistically in concepts and propositions, and then structure those linguistic units using logic. Philosophy's job, then, is to figure out what perception, language, and logic are all about. So what, in a nutshell, has 20th century Anglo-American philosophy had to say about perception, language, and logic? Well, the dominant conclusion about perception is that it is theory-laden. That means that all of our perceptions have theory built into them, what we see. Karl Popper, Norwood Hansen, Paul Feyerabend, Thomas Kuhn, four of the biggest names in the 20th century philosophy of science, all argue that our theories largely dictate what we will see. Now, if this is true, perception then is hardly a neutral and independent check upon our theorizing. Putting it in Kant's original language, our perceptual intuitions do not conform to objects, rather, our intuitions conform to what our faculty of knowledge supplies from itself. Our conceptual structures shape our observations, not vice versa, and so we are stuck inside a subjective system with no direct access to reality. Similar conclusions are reached for language and logic. Language and logic are a conventional, internal system, not objective reality-based tools of consciousness. The positivists, taking Wittgenstein and Carnap as leading examples, and the pragmatists, here taking Quine and Ernest Nagel as leading examples, agree on this. As Wittgenstein puts it in the Tractatus, all the propositions of logic say the same thing. That is, nothing. They say nothing because they are merely a function of how we have decided to use words. But how we use words is conventional. We could have decided differently. We could carve the world up differently with our words. We could, using Nelson Goodman's example, decide not to pick out one color of this color spectrum and call it blue, and then call the neighboring section green, but we could pick out kind of a section in the middle and call it bleen, right? Or grue. It's up to us. Okay? That's a matter of convention. So if language and logic are conventional, then the rules of logic and language hardly say anything about objective reality. And so logical proof cuts no mustard in adjudicating competing claims about fact. Also, if the rules of logic and language are conventional, well, what's to stop someone from adopting different conventions? Nothing. The rules of logic and grammar can be as variable as other conventions, including performance, how we greet each other. Do we shake hands, rub noses, hug, or what? Okay. None of them is more objectively right than the others. Now, by the 1950s, I'm starting to talk faster now, the Rui's conclusions are commonplace. Okay. Next step is Thomas Kuhn's publication in 1962, his monumental Structure of Scientific Revolutions. If science's tools are perception, logic, and language, then science, one of the Enlightenment's prize children, is merely an evolving, socially subjective enterprise with no more claim to objectivity than any other belief system. So I see Kuhn as, in effect, integrating everything that went on beforehand. So by the 1960s, really the pro-science, pro-objectivity spirit that had animated much of Anglo-American philosophy has collapsed. The next step is Richard Rorty's, best known of the American postmodernists, and he generalizes the point to anti-realism. As Kant had said 200 years ago, we can say absolutely nothing about noumena, about what's really real. Rorty's anti-realism is exactly the same point. The idea that we can speak about what's real is just an illusion. There are no objective answers, there is no truth, there are only truths, and truths change. Now, once these conclusions are reached about knowledge and science, the Anglo-American tradition is ready to take seriously Kierkegaard, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. And this is what we start to see happening in the 1960s. All right, after this whirlwind tour then of 200 years of Western philosophy, I can now summarize and offer my first hypothesis about the origins of postmodernism. All of the key ingredients of postmodernism are laid out for them by 20th century philosophers. Most of 20th century philosophy, however, has not been systematic. It's been anti-systematic on principle for the most part. It's been developed in a piecemeal fashion. Postmodernism is the first synthesis, the first system putting together all of the pieces. You've got metaphysical anti-realism, epistemological subjectivity, feeling at the root of all value issues, the consequent relativism of knowledge, relativism of values, the collectivism, the anti-science attitudes are all integrated into a totality. Once we set our reality and reasoning aside, what's left? Well, we have our feelings. When we inspect our feelings, what do we find? Well, from Kierkegaard and Heidegger, we get a deep sense of dread and guilt. From Marx, we get a deep sense of victimization and rage. From Nietzsche, we get a deep sense of a need for power. From Freud, we get a welling up of dark, smutty sexuality. Where do these feelings come from? Well, they're determined, either biologically or environmentally. In either case, I am not individually in control of my feelings. I am a product of my group membership, whether it's economic, sexual, or racial. And of course, the shaping experiences vary from group to group, so differing individuals and different groups have no common experiential framework. There is no objective standard by which to mediate those different feelings. No appeal to reason is obviously possible. Nasty political correctness then makes perfect sense. That's how you impose your group's agenda on other groups. Postmodernism then is the end result of the counter-enlightenment inaugurated by Kant's epistemology. Now that's the first hypothesis. I'm going to talk 2 more minutes. Okay. There's a big problem for this hypothesis, and this will be a homework problem, okay? But I'll give you a clue. I call this the Kantian explanation for postmodernism, and here's the problem. Okay. If deep skepticism about reason and the consequent subjectivism and relativism were the whole story, you would expect a random distribution of positions across the political spectrum adopted by postmodernists. If all of values, including politics, are a matter of a subjective leap into whatever fits your preferences, we should expect to find people making leaps into all kinds of different preferences. Okay? So we should expect a more or less random distribution across the spectrum. This is not what we find in the case of postmodernism. Postmodernists are not people who have reached relativistic conclusions and then found comfort in a variety of political persuasions. Postmodernists are uniformly, monolithically, far left-wing in their politics. Michel Foucault, lefty. Jacques Derrida, lefty. Richard Rorty, Stanley Fish, left. Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, left. Frederick Jameson, way left. Jean-Francois Lyotard, left. Not a single major name, and of all the minor names I've read, not a single one is anything except left, and pretty far left. So there's something else going on here. Part of that something else is that socialism has dominated political philosophy in the 20th century, particularly among academic intellectuals. But this is still puzzling because for most of socialism's intellectual history, it has been defended on modernistic grounds of reason and science. Marx's socialism has been the most dominant version, and that, of course, was scientific socialism. Socialism, socialists argued, could be proved by evidence and rational analysis, and anyone open to the evidence would then see socialism's superiority be proved. So, I'm going to stop there. And the question is, what do we need to add to get the socialist part integrated into the postmodernist framework? Okay. I'll pause there for today, and we'll go now to questions.
Steve, the standard objectivist response to Kant and to most of the various threads you've woven for us through here, through postmodernism, is the sort of self-refutation problem with violation of axioms. What does this tradition have to say about that? What do the postmodernists have to say about this? How aware are they of sort of the standard response that we would make to their basic foundation? Are they, and do they have a response?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two responses to that. One is that, okay, maybe there's a contradiction in my position, but until I can conceive of something else that's better, a philosophical framework that's going to be satisfactory, I'm going to go with the one that seems most on the right track to me, knowing that right now it's got some contradictions. Maybe we'll be able to sort those out in the long run. Now that's kind of an optimistic response. Okay? But it's also a hard thing to do. I mean, if someone points out a contradiction in your philosophy, it's a huge leap then to say, oh, well, there's a contradiction here, and so I throw it all out the window and go into something else. Right? Usually what you do is you try to conserve as much as possible, right? Try to bracket the contradiction, and then make the changes piecemeal. Now, if, however, the contradictions that are pointed out are really deep, right? And you know that your system follows from very deep contradictions, you know that, in effect, your whole system is infected. So you can't really play that game for very long. Then you have a choice. You either then have to get rid of your whole system and go to something else, maybe live in doubt or without a system for a while, which is psychologically hard, or you have to find a way to say the contradiction doesn't matter, even though it's a deep contradiction. And what I see, especially the religious thinkers of the time, as doing is saying you can point out all kinds of contradictions in religion. God is three and God is one. Right? Mary was a virgin, but I don't know how that could have happened. Right? The list goes on. God is omniscient, so he knows everything we're going to do in the future, but still we have free will and we're responsible, and so on. Those are all contradictions. We don't have answers to them, but then that just must mean that logic and contradiction and that whole reason game isn't where reality is at, deeply speaking. And so you just bracket all of that. I know this is true, and then you start talking about faith. Now, is that honest? Well, I don't think so if you formulate it in those terms, but that's what happens. And I think that's pretty clearly what's going on with Kierkegaard.
One of the nice things about postmodernism for us as philosophers is that it's very
the other
easy.
side of the debate here. Okay.
It's very easy for us to go and pick out these absurd quotations and point out contradictions and inconsistencies in their writings. What, in your opinion, is the reason that so many people in academia, so many seemingly intelligent people are attracted to postmodernism as a doctrine? What's the most charitable spin you can put on that?
Yeah, all right. You're asking an awful lot. The charitable spin will come tomorrow, and the socialism is a part of it. I think it's not an accident that the intelligent people whom you would mention, right, as finding themselves attracted to postmodernism are also socialistic. And so I think the primary thing that's going to be driving, or at least something that's going to be driving it deeply, is going to be the political commitments. And we'll explore those tomorrow.
Stephen, this is just a minor point, and I'm asking it. I think that I'm correct, but just correct me if I'm wrong. According to your talk today and this graph, it seems like you're implying that today, I mean, you have analytic philosophy and then postmodernism, and I totally agree that analytic philosophy and the things you point out have led to postmodernism.
Yes.
But aren't the major philosophy departments in the United States predominantly analytic still, and that postmodernism really hasn't taken a hold at all in the philosophy departments?
That's true. Philosophy is, by and large, healthy, right, compared to most other disciplines in the humanities. Where you find the worst manifestations of postmodernism are in English literature, in the law schools, in educational theory, and bizarrely enough, nursing theory. Okay? Read a couple of monographs by nursing theorists, and you have Heidegger. He's the man. Well, there's a story that can be told there. Anyway, yeah, you're quite right that most of the philosophy departments, though, are not deeply infected by it. I mean, they will have people who are Heideggerians, but, you know, the Heideggerian person is one person among 20, right? Or they will have someone perhaps who does deconstruction and French continental philosophy and stuff like that. But for the most part, yeah, they are still in the analytical tradition. The analytical tradition has still got a lot of momentum behind it, and people are still working in it. Right? And, you know, there can be a lot of good work done when you do analytical philosophy, because that analytic work does need to be done. Philosophy, though, I think has by and large, you know, after logical positivism collapsed, said, well, we're just going to go off and do a whole bunch of other things. And so I said, okay, skepticism, well, end of the argument. We don't have an answer to it, but let's go do some applied ethics. And so applied ethics is booming. Or let's go and do classical philosophy. And so Aristotle scholarship is booming, and so on. So the philosophers are mostly going off doing other things.
Can you refute the claim that our perceptions are theory-laden?
Yes, I can.
Now?
Oh, that is a topic. I mean, I wrote in my dissertation most of a chapter that was on that very topic. And I think my very first talk to the Iowa Summer Seminar was on that very issue, and there I talked for about an hour and a half. So what I would suggest is that we pursue that outside of this session, since that's a narrow topic within epistemology, and here today we're doing more intellectual history. But I would love to. I love that topic.
All right, thank you, Steve.
Okay.